From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. About halfway between Hawaii and Australia is the Pacific island nation of Kiribati. In tourism photos, the place looks like a tropical paradise, but the country of about 100,000 people is facing a critical threat to its existence. Climate change has brought more intense storms and worsening king tides that flood across the low-lying nation's beaches through homes and gardens. Even more critically, the encroaching seas are threatening the country's dwindling supplies of fresh water. Island nations like Kiribati have been among those most damaged already by climate change. Their situation is likely to grow worse. That's because greenhouse gas emissions hit a record high last year in spite of global efforts to reduce them. Nearly all of these emissions, of course, are generated in large countries thousands of miles away from Kiribati. Now, on this edition of Global Journalist, we're going to talk about island nations like Kiribati threatened by climate change and what the chances are that people there will be able to successfully adapt. Now, in a few minutes, we'll hear from a panel of experts who have been tracking this issue closely. But first, we're going to talk a bit about the science of how climate change is affecting island nations. For that, we're joined by George Silodius. He's a research physical scientist at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York. He's been both an author and a reviewer of major reports produced by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. George, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we mentioned places like Kiribati are threatened mostly by seawater surging into places where it didn't used to be. Let's talk generally. Just remind us, how is it that climate change is doing this? Like, what precisely is causing this?
Well, there are several different reasons for sea level rise. First, there's what we call thermal expansion of the oceans. Water does expand when it's heated. The second reason is the melting of the ice on land, mostly the melting of Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheets, and also the glaciers that exist on land. Those are the two primary reasons for sea level rise. And in the past century, the primary reason for the rise was the thermal expansion. However, as of the end of the last century and the beginning of this century, the melting of the ice, of the land ice, is becoming the major contributor to sea level rise.
Okay, so just on that first point then, so as the oceans warm, the water literally expands, kind of like a bag of microwave popcorn would expand in your microwave then?
Yeah. You could say that.
Okay, and then the second part of that then obviously is the one most people are most familiar with, and that is the melting of ice caps in Greenland and in Antarctica. But give us just a sense of how fast are sea levels rising. If you live in an island nation, like are you able to see the change over time?
Well, I don't think the change is visible to the naked eye in a sense, but over a long period of time, over 10, 20, or 30 years, yes, you can see the difference. The rise in the past century was small, 1 to 2 millimeters per year. What's worrisome is that as of the beginning of this century, it has almost doubled. It's up to 3 to 4 millimeters per year. That may not sound like a lot, but over a period of 10, 20, or 30 years, it accumulates. And the worrisome part is first that it's accelerating, it's rising faster. And the second is that the contributor now is, as I mentioned before, is the melting of the ice. And the melting of the ice is what we call a non-linear process, meaning that it doesn't have to be going smoothly. It can move in surges. And that can be worrisome. While the thermal expansion is a linear.
So in other
process.
words, like when a big chunk of ice breaks off in Antarctica, then that can cause a big expansion in the seas in one year, and the next year the sea level might not rise so much.
Yeah, but keep in mind, we're not talking about chunks of ice that are already on the water and they break up. We're talking about chunks of ice that are on land and they enter the water. So because a lot of the chunks that you see breaking are already on water. So those don't make a big difference.
And so you talked about how the average rise in the sea level is 3 to 4 millimeters per year now, which is significantly more rapid than it was in the last century. I know predicting the future is difficult, but what do things look like over the next few decades?
Well, it's a hard problem to predict because the melting of the ice in regions like the Greenland and the Antarctica is a very, very complicated process. So it's extremely hard to predict. As best as we can predict, we think that there may be an acceleration that will continue, and that maybe by 2100 we're going to have an increase in the sea level of almost of half a meter. Some predictions even put it to 1 meter, which would be extremely worrisome.
So that would be like a foot and a half to 3 feet then. But I wanted to ask you as well about your area of research, and that is on tropical storms, cyclones, typhoons. Talk to us about how that is affecting people in some of these island nations like Kiribati.
Yeah, well, the thing is that the worst impacts of sea level rise are not felt on a regular day. They're felt on days of storminess where the sea surges. And the question is, what's going to happen to these storms as the climate warms? This is another one of the areas of big uncertainty. We're not very certain of what's going to happen to the frequency of storms because that relates to the steering of those systems, which is very complicated to predict. However, the strength of the storms, we're fairly confident that it's going to increase because the fuel for those storms is the warm waters of the ocean. So as the waters get warmer, the fuel of those storm systems increases, gets more readily available. So when a storm forms, we're fairly confident that it will have better chances to become a strong catastrophic event.
Well, our time does grow short, but if you could, just give us a picture of sort of how much responsibility do people in some of these island nations in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, how much do they bear for causing this problem?
Exactly zero.
And that's and why is that?
Because that very small nations with very little industry, so their contribution to the greenhouse gases that are in our global atmosphere at this point is so small that it's undetectable. So they have no responsibility whatsoever.
Well, George Tseodias, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
This is Global Journalist. On today's program, we're talking about how climate change is threatening the future of many low-lying island nations around the world. We just spoke with George Tseodias of NASA's Goddard Institute. Up next, we're going to talk a bit about what people living on low-lying islands are doing to adapt, as well as what the rest of us might do to help them. For that, we're going to bring in Jeremy Kolitz. He's an engineer by training and is now a researcher at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. Jeremy, welcome.
Thank you.
Also with us in Vancouver is Simon Donner, a climate scientist and professor of geography at the University of British Columbia. Simon, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me.
And on the line is Ben Doherty. He's an Australia-based correspondent for The Guardian. He's on sabbatical now in Oxford, England. Ben, welcome. Well, Jeremy Kolitz, let me start with you. You've done a lot of research on the Pacific island of Vanuatu, which is about 600 miles northeast of Australia. I think there are something like 250,000 people that live there. Tell us just a little bit about how climate change is affecting people there right now.
That's right. We did some recent work around water services and water access in Vanuatu. And one of the difficult things about climate change is what people call the attribution problem, where it's very difficult to say what effects that people are experiencing right now are attributable to climate change or for example, El Nino effects or existing climate variability. But we do see people struggling with climate-related hazards. We were studying water services in rural communities in Vanuatu, And in these communities, water supplies tend to be very basic and are often managed by the communities themselves. So when they experience intense rainfall events, water contamination is quite common and results in the spread of diarrheal diseases. During prolonged dry spells or droughts, it's not uncommon for a primary water source to dry up. And as a result, communities need to seek out alternative water sources, which may be very far away or also unsafe to drink from. And as we mentioned earlier, storm surges and king tides pose a threat to salinization of groundwater, whereby seawater infiltrates through the soil and into groundwater sources and makes those sources not potable for drinking.
Well, Simon Donner, you do research in Kiribati, which we talked about at the top of the program. Talk to us just a little bit about how climate change is affecting the lives of people there.
Well, I mean, Kiribati, like Tuvalu, the Maldives, and other low-lying island countries, is really existentially threatened by climate change. The people in the islands, though, they're also a lot more resilient than you might think from the news. And the problem is that because Kiribati has become this sort of poster child for climate change, people go there with good intentions, during the spring tide, high tides of the year, take video, and you get this image from the outside that this is what it always looks like. But the people of Kiribati, though threatened by climate change, climate change isn't what's on their mind day to day. They worry about healthcare, they worry about education, they worry about food, they worry about water. I mean, the sort of same things that we worry about, actually.
So it sounds like their worries are quite broad, and it's not something, in spite of the fact that their island is threatened, that is something that they're thinking about on a daily basis. But Ben, if I could turn this to you, you cover both immigration as well as climate change, and some island countries like the Maldives, for instance, in the Indian Ocean, have talked about buying land elsewhere so that they could move their population in the event that the Maldives, I think the Maldives is only about 5-6 feet above sea level. In the event that they have to evacuate their entire population, is that something that we're likely to see in the near future, or is that sort of pie in the sky?
No, look, it's not, and I mean it's happened. Kiribati has bought land in Fiji as a last resort, but I think to Simon's point is a very good one, that I think migration is very much a last resort, that the people in these islands are looking to adapt. As they say, their concerns are much more sort of prosaic and day to day than they are about the broader ramifications of climate change. Certainly migration at some point, and in a country like Kiribati, we've seen a lot of internal migration in Kiribati. And elsewhere, migration is certainly an option, and will quite likely be something that needs to be considered, but certainly adaptation is very much for most of these communities in the Pacific what people are looking to do first. They don't want to give up homelands. They don't want to leave places they have enormous connection to over generations. They don't want to abandon homelands. They want to find ways to live there.
Well, Jeremy Kolitz, Ben Doherty mentioned adapting to rising sea levels and these more intense storms that are taking place in tropical regions. In the United States, many other countries, especially industrialized countries, there are large infrastructure projects to protect low-lying cities like New Orleans, giant levees, seawalls. How feasible are things like this in some of these small islands like Vanuatu?
Some of these technological innovations are quite viable in small island nations. Of course, they need to be adapted for the local contexts. In a large way, the political will and the resources are not being put in place to do large-scale engineering innovations. And even so, the viability of those, or the effectiveness of engineering solutions, are limited. Climate change has many impacts that go along a wide range of factors beyond engineering. There's social and political dimensions of climate change. It's likely that women, marginalized groups such as the poor and people living with disabilities will be more detrimentally affected by climate change than men or advantaged groups. And sometimes the most effective way to provide support to these groups is to address issues of inequitable social relationships provide better support from government and civil society, and give people more access to resources and more influence over decision-making processes that they normally don't have. And these kind of social interventions can, in some cases, be more effective than any sort of technological innovation.
Well, Simon Donner, if I could turn things to you. We heard Jeremy Collis talking about how sort of social relations on the islands and how outsiders work with local people may affect the outcomes when it comes to adaptation. One area that you research is coral reefs, I understand. And of course, many of our listeners will be familiar with the bleaching that has killed something like half the coral in the Great Barrier Reef in the past couple of years off Australia. Australia is a big country. It has other resources. How does reef bleaching, how does it affect people in some of these smaller island nations?
Well, it's interesting. You know, I live here in Canada, and when we worry about the plight of the world's coral reefs, you know, for a Canadian or even for most Americans, it's something. It's a distant ecosystem. It's something you see in a Disney movie or on vacation. But for people in places like Kiribati, the reef is their livelihood. It provides, you know, food through fish and other marine resources. It provides income. But number one, it provides protection from the shoreline. It protects the shoreline from waves. And so a reef is not just a physical barrier. It's actually the complexity of the reef. So how the shapes of the different corals and whatnot, that creates drag on incoming waves. So if the reef's dying over time and breaking apart into pieces or being covered more by fleshy plants rather than hard corals, the impacts of sea level rise are going to be even greater.
So the reefs, in a way, it sounds like act as seawalls protecting some of these low-lying islands.
That's right. And one of the challenges really, and this speaks to points that the others made, in a place like Tarawa, the capital of Kiribati, it's home to half of the people. It's got the population density of about Seattle, but you have to recognize there's nothing taller than 2 stories there. So it's a very densely populated place, which means people are living on marginal lands that naturally flood, which means that then they've also in the past taken rocks off the reef to build seawalls, right? And that's sort of exacerbating the erosion problem.
Okay. And so in other words, then it sounds like you're removing one part of your seawall to create another then by doing that. But Ben Doherty, if I could ask you about this climate refugee issue. I mean, it sounds like in some of these countries, it may be just a matter of decades if there aren't some major sort of adaptations that some of these countries will have to be evacuated. We saw that New Zealand has introduced a climate refugee visa recently for some Pacific Islanders. What's sort of the international framework for establishing, visas like this?
Well, I think the legal question is a very interesting one. New Zealand has proposed this new humanitarian visa for people displaced by climate change. It hasn't yet come into being. We don't know whether it will, and we don't quite know what shape it will take. The legal framework is very important, and the mechanisms by which people might move if they're forced to are one of the key sort of points of contention. The Refugees Convention, which we've had since 1951, doesn't fit for people who are displaced by climate change. To be a refugee under the Refugees Convention, you must have a well-founded fear of persecution, and there are 5 grounds for that. Being displaced by a rising sea or by your water supply becoming inundated by seawater, your land just generally becoming unlivable, doesn't qualify you for the Refugees Convention. So the protections that exist there don't work. So there is a great deal of discussion about exactly how this might work in terms of people being able to move, and there is talk about sort of circular migration, access rights to labour markets in neighbouring countries, enabling people. Anote Tong is the former president of Kiribati. He talks about migration with dignity, the idea that people are given some agency, some autonomy over the way they move, and some control, that it's not a sort of desperate and harried fleeing right at the very end, but mechanisms and procedures and plans are put in place to allow people to move.
Because it sounds like what could happen is that, the islands aren't just going to sink into the sea, but as the farmland that people depend on becomes salinized, or drinking water supplies becomes scarce in certain seasons, people are going to go move elsewhere to look for work seasonally and perhaps return back to their home islands for other parts of the year.
Precisely, and I think perhaps in the public imagination, the idea of sinking islands has this sort of very dramatic denouement that as the waves come over the last patch of dry land, people are forced to swim for their lives. It's very likely that people will have left long before that, years before that, in fact, because these low-lying islands will become increasingly uninhabitable without adaptation measures. So, perhaps it's a better way to sort of conceptualise migration rather than as some event that people are suddenly forced to move, but rather as a process that people are putting in plans and contingency plans for what happens if the sea levels rise, if the water becomes unpotable, and those sorts of things. It's perhaps not going to be quite so dramatic as the public imagination holds it.
A reminder that you're tuned into Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On today's program, I'll look at how low-lying island nations are coping with the threat of climate change ahead of the UN Climate Conference in Poland in December. We're joined by Jeremy Kolitz of the University of Technology, Sydney, Simon Donner of the University of British Columbia, and Ben Doherty of The Guardian. If you're interested in more Global Journalists, check us out online at globaljournalist.org. There you can find our archives and additional coverage of underreported international news and human rights issues. You can also like us on Facebook, where we live stream, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, or see our videocast on YouTube. Jeremy Kolitz, if I could move this back to you, for a place like Vanuatu, what's the timeline for how much longer this country will be inhabitable without some really significant changes in how quickly the climate is changing or how rapidly they are building these adaptation mechanisms? I mean, are we talking about decades, a century, a few years? Can you give us some sort of picture of that?
Well, in the case of Vanuatu, hopefully many, many centuries. Vanuatu is a mountainous volcanic island, as most Melanesian islands, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea are. Increasingly, coastal areas from Vanuatu could become less habitable, where the majority of the population resides. However, they don't face the sort of existential threat that low-lying atoll islands like Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Marshall Islands do. In terms of timelines, it's very hard to predict when exactly people will need to move because there's a lot of uncertainty. There's some uncertainty with the models and projections for what the future climate will look like physically. There's even more uncertainty about how society will respond. Even though things are not looking too good right now, there still is time to aggressively reduce greenhouse gas emissions and postpone or even possibly completely avoid this situation if we're able to collectively act on this. And then for the low-lying atolls, there's also a lot of uncertainty around the geomorphology of these islands. There's good reason to believe that many of them will become uninhabitable, as Ben has mentioned, but there's some conflicting evidence about how some islands may just change shape. Some may actually even grow. So it's important that we continue to invest in adaptation and making these islands habitable for as long as possible. There's quite a lot of room for human ingenuity. There's room to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which would extend the lifespan, for a lack of a better word, of these islands for many more decades.
Well, Simon Donner, if we could just talk for a moment about the UN climate discussions. Obviously, several years ago after the Paris Accords, there was some optimism that there was going to be sort of international cooperation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Last year, greenhouse gas emissions hit a record. And so, I mean, is it still reasonable for countries like Kiribati to be sort of staking part of their future on greenhouse gas emissions being reduced so significantly over the next decade, 15 years, something like that, that they will, in effect, be able to be protected?
Well, I think, as Jeremy was saying, that the future for low-lying countries like Kiribati is sort of painted in this stark black and white picture most of the time, where there is actually some nuance. And so, the islands aren't going to simply slowly yield to the sea. if you're trying to think about how a coral reef islands like Kiribati are going to respond to sea level rise, it's kind of like balancing a bank account. You have to think about the deposits of sediment as well as the withdrawals. And so every time a high tide crashes into a village, it's actually also depositing sand and gravel and whatnot. And so, as Jeremy was mentioning, the islands won't simply disappear, they'll kind of change shape. The danger is the process by which these islands are sort of resilient and can adapt is tough if people are living there, right? Because the groundwater is getting more salty, land's getting reshaped. And so it's going to become more and more basically expensive to live there. It doesn't mean the place will become permanently necessarily uninhabitable, but it might become prohibitively expensive to live in. And that's where the other part of the UN climate negotiations is so important, which is how are we going to help the developing world financially to deal with climate change? Are we going to be providing enough funding and support through international aid to help these places adapt? Right now, Kiribati does receive a lot of aid money, but it's in these kind of one-off pie-in-the-sky projects often, and it's because outsiders hear about the country as if it's in this desperate rush to survive. Whereas what Kiribati and Tuvalu and the Marshalls really needs is just sort of consistent long-term support, not this sort of like breathless rush.
Well, Ben Doherty, if I could turn this to you then, I want to ask as well about sort of the overall political climate for accepting migrants or refugees. Obviously, that has changed globally in terms of even how much people in the West and other countries are willing to accept refugees from war-torn countries like Syria. I mean, to the extent that we do see some changes in migration patterns as a result of this, I mean, where are people from some of these islands likely to go?
Look, the obvious answer is in the region if people are forced to move. And look, I don't think we should pretend that the Pacific Islands, if they become uninhabitable, these will be the first climate displaced people. I mean, you look at a conflict like Syria, and in large parts there was enormous pressure inside Syria caused by a very, very long-running drought that caused huge prices in spikes in the price of food, great deal of urbanisation and those sorts of things. So climate is often not just a single factor driving migration, but is an exacerbator of existing tensions. It's been described as a threat multiplier by some people. So I think it needs to be understood that the impacts of climate change don't exist in a vacuum. There are broader social and legal issues at play as well. I think as well, one of the things Simon touched on and George a little earlier is interesting and one thing that often gets overlooked is a kind of moral argument to sort of argue, well, what responsibility, what ethical responsibility, what moral responsibility does the industrialised world hold towards people who are displaced by climate change? As George was saying, the Pacific is the region on Earth that's produced the least amount of carbon, but is feeling the impacts of climate change first and most acutely. So countries like Australia, one of the biggest emitters in the world per capita, a very large exporter of coal, is there a moral obligation on a country like Australia to accept people who are displaced by the climate change they've caused? Well,
that's going to have to do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to George Seodius, Ben Doherty, Jeremy Kolitz, and Simon Donner. Our assistant producers this week are Nikki Bram and Madison Conti. Our supervising producer is Edom Kasaye, with visual editor Maggie Duncan. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.